welcome to all of you joining us for today's online conversation with Molly Worthen on charisma, the hidden dynamic that shapes the world. We're delighted that so many of you have registered today. And if you haven't already done so, let us know where you're joining us from in the chat box. It's always fun to see people tuning in from all over the world. I'd like to send a special welcome to our first time guests who are joining us today, as well as to our nearly 100 international guests joining us from around 20 different countries that we know of, ranging from Mexico to Malaysia and beyond. So if you haven't already done so, let us know where you're from and welcome. It's good to see so many people here today. If you are one of those first time attendees or are otherwise new to the work of the Trinity Forum, we seek to provide space for leaders to wrestle with the big questions of life in the context of faith and offer an invitation to ultimately come to better know the author of the answers. Our programs and publications are designed to be hospitable spaces where we can wrestle with those great truths together, and we're glad you're here. Our guest today is a scholar who has analyzed the strangeness and volatility of our contemporary life through what might be a surprising conceptual lens, a word first coined by the Apostle Paul, charisma. After Paul used the term in his letters to the Romans and Corinthians to describe the gifts of the Spirit that to reveal themselves in her followers, as well as the gift of salvation itself, others from outside the faith saw that he was onto something and sought to adapt and apply the idea to their corners of the world. And while the meaning and manifestations of the idea of charisma has continued to evolve, our guest today argues that understanding charisma is vital to understanding history, particularly American history, where this hidden dynamic helps explain the forces that create leaders, enthrall followers, and shape our world. Molly Worthen is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as a freelance journalist. She has lectured widely as well as taught courses on North American religious and intellectual history, global Christianity, and the history of ideas, and has written widely on religion, politics, and higher education for the New York Times, as well as contributing to the New Yorker, Slate, The American Prospect, Foreign Policy Magazine, and many other publications. She's also the author of several book-length works, including Apostles of Reason and The Man on Whom Nothing Was Lost, as well as her latest work, Spellbound, How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump, which we've invited her here today to discuss. Molly, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's great to have you here. So, as we start out, many of us nowadays think of charisma as perhaps an engaging, magnetic personality type, someone perhaps like unusually charming or larger than life. But you have used the term very differently. And in fact, in the many examples of charismatic leadership that you describe in your book, and there are many, uh, many of them are far from charming, I would say. So, as we start out, it would be helpful just to kind of get a sense of what is charisma as you're defining it, and why do you believe that it is so vital to understanding American religious, cultural, and political life?
This is a great place to start. When I began this project, I was interested in writing about charisma, both in that New Testament sense and the various manifestations of the Holy Spirit, how American Christians and kind of people adjacent to Christian culture have interpreted supernatural action in the world, but then also charisma in this much fuzzier sense. It's a word that over the past 2 or 3 generations, Americans have used with increasing frequency to talk about politics, religion, and other spheres where a leader has some kind of ineffable hold over followers. But I think it's often a term that we punt to when we are witnessing a dynamic between a leader and followers that we don't quite understand. We can't interpret it. We can't figure out, kind of what is the deal? Why are these people attracted to this individual? And certainly when I began this project, I confused charisma with charm. I thought I would be writing about loads of really good-looking people who knew how to work the room at a cocktail party and make you feel like the center of attention, and they would probably all be amazing public speakers. And that turned out to be true here and there, but really it was more the exception than the rule. The pattern that emerged was that charismatic leaders are deeply polarizing. There is some broad swath of people who find them really compelling, but just as many, probably more people who find them revolting, and not too many who are lukewarm. Where I ended up landing on this sort of political sense of charisma, what this means is that the heart of charisma is not charm. It's a kind of storytelling. It's a relationship between the leader and followers, premised on the leader's ability to invite followers into a new transcendent narrative that connects their individual, puny, private chaos and suffering and frustration to a much bigger story with a meaning well beyond themselves, and gives them simultaneously a sense of some agency, some idea where it's all headed, but not too much control. Also provides a sense of security, having turned over the reins to a person, to forces bigger than yourself. And I think the reason it's polarizing has everything to do with the fact that the charisma resides in the story. So if a leader is inviting you into a narrative that makes better sense of your life than the other narratives on offer in the culture, and you like the role he's offering you, then you're probably going to be attracted. But if instead he or she has written you out of the story or cast you as a villain, you are going to find that individual pretty repulsive, regardless of their public speaking skills or, how winning their smile is. And understanding charisma as a story helped me, I think, see it as a lens through which to understand the particular anxieties and desires that pervade American culture in different periods of this country's history. And it helped me kind of begin to answer a big question that I guess I've been wrestling with for years as a historian who's focused on religion. And that is, where exactly do human religious impulses go as a society is secularizing? If by that we mean we're seeing a decline in participation in organized religion, the places that scholars and journalists normally go to get some sort of shorthand for religious belief and practice in a country. Those usual, sources of poll data, statements from, the elite pulpits, that's no longer really giving us kind of the pulse of American spirituality, I think, in the way it once did. But I've always believed that humans are, in a pretty fundamental sense, religious beings, and that we
Yeah.
we crave a way to connect ourselves to a transcendent story. We crave an object of worship. Just because that impulse is not landing as frequently as it once did in churches doesn't mean it's evaporating. We just have to look elsewhere, and maybe the relationship between some leaders and followers is a place to look.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And boy, is there a lot to unpack there. But one of the first things that sort of occurred to me is that, so many of the explanations for our current civic challenges, political and cultural dysfunctions, and so what, are at least somewhat materialist. Certainly secular. And in some ways, it sounds like what you're saying, what your book is saying, is that where we are is almost the inevitable outcome of unmet spiritual hungers. I mean, the call to be part of a transcendent story that is larger than yourself is in many ways a religious appeal. Do I have that right, or would you modulate that?
I think that's right. I think there have been uh, sort of shifts over time in how historians have made sense of the mix of human motivations. And I think for a long time, and perhaps this is still true among kind of the mainstream of secular historians of American history, there is a tendency to emphasize material motives and hypothesize that people who are attracted to a mass movement or one kind or another, and certainly people who are attracted to highly supernaturally inflected forms of religion, oh, well, they must be people who are really have-nots in the economic sense.
Hmm.
The old phrase, for thinking about millenarian movements or Pentecostals was, well, those are examples of the religion of the dispossessed. But there's been a more recent wave of scholarship that's really challenged that and gone back and looked at some particular moments, for example, done some more granular socioeconomic analysis of the 1906 Azusa Street revival and the explosion of modern Pentecostalism that followed that. And these scholars have revised the initial conclusion of earlier historians who said that that movement was really just, impoverished and lower working class people. And they've said, in fact, there's evidence to suggest that it's a much more socioeconomically diverse group of people who are attracted to this message and this invitation to encounter the divine and step outside their sort of usual lanes of living. In my kind of survey of these 4 centuries of history and a pretty wide range of movements that we might classify as religious and others that we would classify as more political, I find that yes, there's always some desire, some want, something that for the follower is not being satisfied, a question that needs
Hmm.
answering. But people feel alienated from the universe for all kinds of reasons. And sometimes people who are very comfortably materially are existentially miserable and just as wanting of a charismatic relationship that explains that as someone who is materially struggling.
Yeah. You mentioned just a minute or two ago the invitation into a broader story, which also it seems like is essentially involves an act of surrender. And there seems to be kind of a paradox going on. Like in some cases, the leader essentially offers, a larger story, empowerment, new meaning, new significance. But in at least some cases, in actuality, what they're doing is they're grabbing more power for themselves, but not for others. And they're not spreading the empowerment. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about how it all actually plays out. And on top of that, perhaps you can reflect a little bit about the appeal of the charismatic leader to someone who seems like they might be outside the story, even excluded by the story. And part of what I'm thinking about here is, on one side of the family, like, my late grandmother was a member of a very legalistic, very fundamentalist church with a pastor who was very charismatic. There was very little role for women at all in the story that he offered, besides service and self erasure. And yet there was an appeal to his particular strand of charismatic leadership that seemed undeniable. What do followers get in an instance like that? And why are there so many of us who seem to want to surrender to a larger story in a society that seems to, or at least claims to, so value autonomy?
Boy, that is a really rich question, and there's so much variety across the I think different
Mhm.
different examples that I have circulating in my mind now. I mean, this question of gender is particularly interesting because I found myself writing about more instances of women who are making claims to charismatic authority in the earlier period of American history before they had more reliable access to other forms of authority. I riff very much in my way of defining charisma on Max Weber, the German sociologist who set charismatic authority in contrast with authority premised on institutional position or tradition or having access to, a lot of military power. And in many ways, charismatic authority is the option of the weak.
Mhm.
It's the
Yeah,
move you make
yeah.
if you want power, you're called, you have a vocation, and you have no more reliable worldly means of acting on it. And you need to do a kind of end run around hierarchical authority. And I think the way this plays out in the kind of power charisma ultimately gives the leader depends a lot on whether the leader is able to kind of instantiate that charismatic authority in an institution, in a set of practices and procedures that do provide a way of kind of corralling and controlling followers. And often that's not present. And so there is a simultaneously like a real fiery power to charisma, but also an ephemeral dimension to it. It can, if it's not kind of embedded in structures relatively quickly, it can sort of evaporate if followers change their minds. I mean, I begin the book at a point in American history when there's really not much daylight between charisma in the New Testament sense and charisma in that more political sense. And that is in Puritan Massachusetts in the 1630s. And I start with the story of the famous Puritan heretic Anne Hutchinson, who is this kind of self-taught. I almost think of her as a theologian in the trenches because she was kind of doing part-time work as a midwife. So she was helping families, deal with the regular rhythm of infant and maternal suffering and death that just was, a huge
Yeah.
part of the human experience until relatively recently in our history. And I think as a consequence, frankly, of that experience, she saw the way in which the version of Reformed Protestant discipleship that she and her fellow colonists were hearing from the Puritan pulpit was not really answering their questions. The Puritan ministers were trying to sort of do balance that tension that is always present in the Christian tradition between emphasizing God's free and capricious grace and the need for Christians to live like Jesus and walk with Jesus,
Mhm.
right? And so they preached a message of preparation that you can do certain things. You can't control whether or not you are among the elect, but you can do certain things to guarantee you are ready if that call from God comes. And Anne Hutchinson began holding meetings in her house that initially were just a few women gathered once a week to discuss the sermon from the previous weekend. They quickly expanded. Women began bringing their husbands. They started meeting twice a week, having to, bring extra chairs into the parlor to make room for
Yeah.
people. And word got out that she was criticizing her these ministers, most of them, and saying that they were effectively preaching works righteousness, earned salvation. And in fact, her message was you can through studying the Bible and just discerning, listening for the Holy Spirit, you can expect God to tap you on the shoulder. You can expect to hear directly that you are among the elect. And I think that this invitation, this it speaks directly to the kind of paradoxical need that I think you're articulating, that people want simultaneously freedom and security, because it is a message, especially if you think about the lived experience of these families, who's, may be scratching their heads and just devastated in the wake of a stillbirth and trying to make sense of, what is God's intention here? How do we think about the ultimate fate of that infant? And a message that allows for a sort of more direct line to the Holy Spirit is really compelling. And at a certain point, she had half the congregation of Boston on her side, supporting her criticisms of the elite magistrates and ministers. But fairly soon, the
Yeah.
disciplinary machinery of the colony gets sort of into action, and she's put on trial and banished. But in many ways, she has, I think, kind of the last word, because when I think about the marrow of her message, this emphasis on the personal relationship with the divine, that seems to me to really be the abiding through line in so much of American spirituality, Christian or not. So I think in communities, like the one you're describing, that there is there's often this balance between a lived, weekly routine that is fairly circumscribed, that often involves deference to the person claiming authority, but usually there are mechanisms and ideas and practices that allow for the experience of a kind
Mhm.
of red phone hotline to the divine that give
Yeah.
you a sense of that balance of security and yet freedom, yet being sort of
Mhm.
part of this active vanguard of the work God's
Yeah.
doing in the world.
Yeah. It's interesting because as you say, in many ways, Anne Hutchison, what she preached remains very, in fact, I think there's many who may not consider her a heretic at all. And, even in the ways that you have described or even defined charisma, like the unveiling of a hidden narrative, one of the things that sort of strikes me is like there's a sense in which charisma is not too far from, perhaps related to Gnosticism, in basically divining or intuiting hidden or secret knowledge that helps make sense of the world and our place in it. Which, and just a little bit further out, perhaps, are conspiracies, which also seem not at all unrelated. I'm curious, do you see a link between these, or is that just the perversion of charisma?
I think there absolutely is a link, and that is a pattern I noticed in the relationships many of these leaders cultivated with followers. They had a gift for sensing what is a compelling uh, picture of a hidden reality to invite followers into, and does that follower need in the way of evidence to have the experience of being an autonomous thinking decision maker who is truly weighing the evidence and making the choice to join this movement and kind of claim a sense of identity as one who really sees the whole picture while most people are bumbling around half blind to what's really going on in the world. I was really struck by this dimension of the story of Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church. And really studying his story in more detail than I had before brought together a lot of the broader patterns I ended up seeing across American history. But one was his knack for understanding the kind of mix of credulity and skepticism as it manifested in the early American Republic. And the desire investigators into the Mormon claims had to want to really have the sense of themselves as making a discerning decision. So his presentation of this new revelation, the Book of Mormon in King James Bible English, just having the sound, the resonance of authority that people in that culture, kind of post-Puritan New England, expected God to speak in. He early on, he takes two groups of friends and family into the woods, and they then claim that the angel Moroni appeared to them as well and presented the golden plates, allowed them to handle the plates, and they sign affidavits swearing to this. And that also it kind of comports with what people at the time are wanting in the way of evidence, to have this sense that they are doing due diligence. And yet from the beginning there's this other dimension of the Mormon case, which is pray on it, ask for the Holy Spirit to speak to you directly. Is this true? And fairly early in the formation of the church, these first Mormons begin speaking in tongues. That the New Testament sense of charisma, and this is not something we associate with Mormons today, because in fact, in the more modern period, the church effectively banned glossolalia, speaking in tongues, is not the done thing. But the first Mormons spoke in tongues all the time. And Joseph Smith, my sense is that he didn't necessarily instigate this, but he welcomed it and he channeled it. And the early Mormons really understood their mission as totally entwined with the divine destiny of the American continent. The first editions of the Book of Mormon were dedicated, in a sense, specifically to indigenous Americans. The subtitle was, a second testament to the Lamanites, which is, of course, in Mormon mythology, it's the name for the, Semitic people who end up as the original settlers of much of the Americas. And there's this sort of fusion of manifest destiny in that kind of familiar 19th century sense, and
Yeah.
this divine version of it that is inviting these first Mormons into this really exciting story of God's intention for America. But it's one that is premised on coming and seeing this hidden story that other people
Mhm.
have been blind to. I think we love, as humans, we love the feeling of being in on a secret, and we are constantly looking for ways to make the
Mhm.
chaos make sense. So there is, I mean, throughout American history, there
Yeah.
is this, Americans particularly, but I think all humans have a sort of taste for this, and I think it ebbs and flows in its broad appeal in times of crisis and times when, people are searching for alternatives to the traditional narratives.
Mhm. That all makes sense. But I want to ask you about something that has, kind of baffled and unsettled me, which is, we mentioned conspiracies as well as Gnosticism just a little bit earlier. As Christians, we have already been invited into a transcendent narrative. We have been offered a story unlike any other, to participate, to know and worship God, to participate in the recreation, redemption of the world. Like it really doesn't get much better than that. And yet, uh, it is it is unsettling that for certain conspiracies, it's actually self-reported evangelical Christians who are the most susceptible to them. I'm thinking in particular about the Q conspiracy theory, but there's others as well. Why, in your mind, having been a scholar of this, would uh, would those of us who affirm the divinity of Christ, who call ourselves Christians, who've already been invited into the ultimate story, still have need for Gnostic intuition or insight, or a different kind of story?
Yeah, I mean the short answer is original sin, right? But I think there's a
That
sort of
covers a
there's like a
lot, doesn't
broad,
it?
yeah, it does. That's my answer to everything. That was my answer, before I became a Christian, like before I became a
Mhm.
theist. The doctrine of
Yeah.
original sin was self-evidently true, right?
Mhm.
I think there's a broad theological point here to make, and then maybe a point more specific to our current time. The Christian story requires radical submission, and we don't, our depraved concupiscent selves, we don't like submission, and we are constantly trying to reshape Jesus and his claims on us to meet our needs. But that's not how it works. So I think we seek charismatic relationships where we can get away with projecting our needs and desires onto the leader, where we get a story that casts us as heroes without the work involved. I mean, I think of
Mhm.
the rich young ruler in Matthew 19, right? Who asks Jesus, what must he do to have eternal life? And Jesus says, well, you have to sell all you have and give to the poor. And he does not want to hear that. And I think we are all like him to some extent, and we resist total submission. So we are tempted by human leaders who promise a kind of worldly salvation that does not involve that kind of sacrifice. But then I think
Mhm.
there are some factors specific to our moment. I think many conservative Christians are feeling insecure about their status in the culture right now. They used to have a certain kind of influence on American culture, or at least perceive themselves to have that influence, and
Mhm.
now
Yeah.
feel marginalized in all kinds of ways, feel marginalized from institutions of sort of prestigious elite authority, as the country changes demographically, the sea change in really just a few years on sexual ethics in particular. And so there's a way in which the kind of de facto cultural Protestant consensus that abided for many generations allowed conservative Christians to forget that this is Babylon, this is not our city.
Yeah.
And so now they miss having control or the appearance of control over the city. And so maybe that has contributed to a kind of susceptibility to leaders and to
Mhm.
stories that promise to restore that control, even if, and maybe especially if it means kind of running roughshod over, institutional checks and balances to do so, because we're also in a time, and this affects all Americans, not just conservative Christians, of deep disillusionment with institutions. And I know this has been a,
Yeah.
kind of an ongoing theme in Trinity Forum conversations, but it's hugely important for understanding the importance of charismatic leaders in our own time, because in every era of history, charismatic leaders are in a kind of dialectical relationship with institutions,
Yeah.
and they derive their purchase on the cultural discourse from their kind of critical distance from institutions, offering alternative narratives to whatever the institutions are offering. But often they make the leap and they enter a kind of productive, sometimes an insider relationship with those institutions. So it's complicated, but they're
Mhm.
sort of two sides of the same coin.
Mhm. There's so many more questions to ask you, but we're rapidly running out of time. I want to ask you just real quickly about institutions, and then one more, and then we'll go to our questions from our audience. But with institutions, so much that could potentially be asked. One of the things that sort of struck me in the process of just reading and digesting your book, you mentioned Max Weber earlier. And largely, I mean, not entirely, you nuanced it just then, but kind of largely, he sort of saw the work of charisma as being uh, certainly in tension, maybe even at times in opposition to institutions and to what you've called like the bureaucratic impulse to basically systematize, provide processes and the like. But of course, in a liberal democracy, a rule of law is premised on uh, procedural justice. We have systems and processes, and it's not like any of us are under the illusion that perfect justice is always served, but we try to come up with systems and processes that get us as close as we can in a fallen world. In your sense, or just in your reading, is charismatic leadership um, at odds with liberal democracy, or can they coexist well?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's even more important because I see charismatic relationships as just part of how we organize ourselves as humans. I don't think
Yeah.
it's possible to escape them or extinguish them. I'm not sure we should want to. I think there are plenty of charismatic movements that have, I think, led to moral progress. But I think the answer to your question is that yes, there is a sense in which charisma is kind of inherently illiberal. If the core meaning of liberal is that the unit of ultimate value is the autonomous individual, an individual who deserves protection if he's in the minority against the masses, and that priority on the individual then is the foundation of all the procedures and institutions that ground liberal democratic practice in the West. And this is then a set of guardrails that are supposed to bind leaders and prevent, keep a limit on what leaders can do simply by activating popular support. So there's a fundamental tension there that
Mhm.
cannot be resolved. But this is not to say that charismatic leaders can't operate inside the bounds of democratic
Yeah.
processes. I mean, I think
Mhm.
it's quite rare to see a leader whose authority is purely charismatic. And I mean, this was something that Weber highlighted too,
Mhm.
while he found it helpful, and I agree that it's helpful to think in the abstract in terms of a kind of a typology of types of authority. In practice, usually you encounter a kind of hybrid. But when a charismatic leader, moves from being a sort of outsider at the head of a movement to being someone who's operating inside an institution, it does, I think, require a certain tamping down of that
Mhm.
charisma because the charisma is inherently anti-procedural. And there's a corollary to this, in the context of New Testament charisma. I mean, even the wildest Pentecostal church, right? If it lasts beyond one revival, it has to have procedures. It has to have church
Mhm.
offices. It has to have a culture of transmitting ideas over time. So you've
Yeah.
absolutely identified a key tension that does not
Mhm.
go away.
Yeah, before we turn to audience questions, one thing you mentioned earlier was your own faith. And I understand that you are an adult convert to Christianity, that if I may have it right, that Tim Keller and J.D. Greear played a role in that, that you'd actually been a scholar of religion before becoming a Christian yourself. And I'm curious how your research and your scholarship on religion affected your coming to faith, if at all, and then conversely, how your understanding of your faith has affected and influenced this most recent work.
I became a Christian a little more than 3 years
Mm.
ago, when I suppose I was about two-thirds done with this book. And I mean, my own desire for ultimate metaphysical answers was always a part of my professional work. I really think I became a historian of Christianity as a way of sidling up alongside Christianity because I couldn't really get there myself. I mean, I made a couple of
Mm.
very incompetent efforts early in my life, in college and in graduate school, to try to get myself churched, and it just didn't work out. And I was in a place of, it's like, discontented but fairly apathetic agnosticism when uh, JD evangelized me with a strong assist from Tim Keller. And yeah, it's a long story, which yeah, people can look up some of the interviews I've done online if they want like the full version. But I will say, I found myself pondering, okay, in my own story, here I am writing a book about charisma, and these two Christian leaders that a lot of people would call fairly charismatic, like, played
Mhm.
this significant
Yeah.
role in helping me see the Christian story in a new way and see my own way into it in a way I could investigate it as a historian. I've really focused on historical evidence for the resurrection in a way that I hadn't before. But I had this nagging voice in my head, like, what have I just gotten? Have I fallen for, a guru, right? Like the very people I'm writing
Yeah.
about. And it prompted me to think about some of the differences between healthy, charismatic dynamic and an unhealthy one. And I think in both the case of Tim and JD, were absolutely inviting me into a story, inviting me into the ultimate story, but not presenting themselves as the absolute arbiter of what's
Right.
true, not trying in any way to limit, what I read, who I worshiped with, any of this, but instead saying, actually, can I come alongside you while we explore this amazing 2,000-year-old global tradition? And avail ourselves of everything it has to offer, and all of these people who, whatever question I would come up with, problem of evil,
Mm.
other faiths, like, you name it, right? I mean, there are loads of super smart people in the Christian tradition who've wrestled with it. And I think both
Yeah.
both Tim and JD saw themselves as more like Virgil in Dante's Inferno, right? Like more
Yeah.
like a guide,
Yes.
coming
Mhm.
alongside. And I
Mhm.
think that is the right kind of leadership.
Mhm.
That the leader is a kind of gateway to an institution, to traditions. It does, the buck doesn't stop and sense with that individual. But I also, to go from being a functional like materialist in my metaphysics to suddenly deciding that the balance of evidence pushed me to believing in an open universe in which God intervenes. I mean, of course, it changed how I was thinking about the the crazy supernatural stuff that I was writing about. And toward the end of my research, as I was beginning to research modern, more recent events where people are still alive, and I was, able to do interviews and do kind of more ethnography, I was, attending some Pentecostal charismatic worship services and revivals, and certainly experiencing them in a new way, and uh, trying to interrogate my own assumptions and reactions in a new way. But I am a
Mhm.
spiritual infant. I'm still learning how it should work.
Mhm. That's great. Well, we're going to turn to questions from our viewers today. And just as a reminder, if you're joining us for the first time, you can not only ask a question in the Q&A feature, but you can also like questions. That helps give us a sense of what some of the most popular questions are. So our first question comes from Peter Sherman, who asks, he says, Vincent Lloyd has written A Defense of Charisma, in which he talks about good and bad charisma. Depending on whether it reveals itself and empowers people or if it perpetuates the spell and keeps people bound to the leader's own interests. Can you apply this to the American history of charisma that you've laid out?
Charisma in itself is morally neutral. And I think the way we tell good charisma from bad, charisma that is ultimately um, an agent of moral progress, and that which really serves to simply accrue power, self-serving power to the leader, has everything to do with whether the story that the charismatic leader is offering is tethered to reality. And I think this means that it is incumbent as much as possible, and this is harder than ever in our own era, on the followers or people considering joining a movement to interrogate that story. I
Mhm,
think when I use the term storytelling, it can sound like I'm saying that charismatic leaders just make stuff up, and I'm not saying that at all. I mean, I think
mhm,
we are storytelling, story craving creatures. That's
mhm,
simply how we organize information about the world. So, I think about someone like Martin Luther King Jr., who
right.
I absolutely see as a charismatic leader, who
Mhm,
I think did a combination of things in drawing people's attention, especially with a major assist from the new technology, from the way in which many of his movements clashes with authorities in the South were televised, drawing Americans' attention to information that they simply
mhm,
didn't know before. But also, I mean, especially for African Americans, simply giving them a way to kind of reorganize the information they already had, and
mhm,
see a new kind of more active role for themselves in that. I also
mhm,
see in King a pattern that I noticed among the more successful leaders. If by success we mean the ability to instantiate a set of policy goals into an institutional framework that outlasts the career of the individual. And that is that King did not hew narrowly to the dominant charismatic type of his era, but he showed a kind of agility. So I tell his story in the context of an era I call the era of the experts. And it's this anomalous period in American history because, for the most part, Americans have a habit of being suspicious of experts and elite institutions, at least ambivalent about them. But there is, in the
mhm,
wake of World War II, this sense that, okay, if charismatic leadership means Hitler, if it means fascist, murderous demagoguery, then it has no place in a liberal democracy. And we should trust the technocrats and trust the experts. And there is this period between about 1945 and 1965 in which the story that experts tell has charisma. And King plugs into that. So if you watch his interviews on, some of the television news networks, he really leans into his background as an academic with a PhD, speaking in cool, rational tones, assuring majority white viewers that he is the moderate, reasonable option, in this increasingly dicey spectrum of activists calling for change. But in other contexts, he leans very much into what I'd call a more prophetic charisma, drawing
Mhm.
on, that deep relationship he had in his vocation as a Baptist pastor, his connection to the Christian prophetic tradition. He shows a kind of agility. And then
Yeah.
fundamentally, and what really characterizes good charisma, I think, is that he submits his own charismatic authority and its goals to the liberal democratic process. So he's not, calling for, a secessionist movement, a kind of political independence or mass violence, but rather, a groundswell of support for legislative changes that go hand in hand with cultural changes, but in the lanes of those procedural guardrails we spoke about before.
Yeah. So I'm going to combine two somewhat related questions. An anonymous attendee asked, do you think that the project of forming people to wield power is an inherently competitive project with the vision in the New Testament, i.e., forming those in the image of the suffering servant who poured himself out for the sake of the other? Somewhat related is a question by Rob Tribkin, who asked, is there also among many of us an intuitive opposition to charismatic leaders? So, two challenges, I guess, to the idea of charismatic leadership there.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Both questions put me in mind of the research I did on the 60s, 70s, 80s, and the kind of convergence of trends in popular psychology with trends in the business world and the burgeoning area of
Yeah.
leadership studies. So, in the field of psychology, this is the era when the humanist psychologists, the positive psychologists, Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, really come to the fore, propounding this idea of self-actualization as the core of the path to human flourishing. In reaction to earlier psychological schools, Freud, Skinner, and the behaviorists who had a fairly negative, pathologized view of the human person, focused on particular neuroses. These humanist psychologists say, every human has the potential to reach the most flourishing version of him or herself. And the job of the expert psychologist is to not stand in judgment, but to come alongside and help the patient self-actualize. And that way of thinking, I mean, well, it comes to pervade American culture in so many ways, but it really comes to inform how people in the business world begin thinking about and theorizing about leadership and boss-employee relations. And so you start to see this shift in the kind of the world of pop business leadership books and business school programs to talking about how your boss ought to be your coach, and a good boss helps
Mhm.
his employees be their best selves and find a kind of spiritual sustenance and satisfaction by aligning their personal sense of mission with the mission of the company. And so, you have breakout books like Tom Peters' book, In Search of Excellence, which I think he publishes in
Yeah.
1982 or something like this. That is all about, it's sort of a turn away from the obsession with quantitative ways of measuring companies and a focus on how companies need to meet employees and consumers spiritual needs. And I mean, absolutely, it's in tension with, I
Yeah.
think, the New Testament understanding of human flourishing and what charisma really is. But it's part of this broader turn in American society in which the story that the culture is telling us is that we can be our own messiahs in one way or another.
Yeah.
We can save
Yeah.
ourselves. And so when we try that and it doesn't work, with the self-help books let us down, I think we are more vulnerable than ever when a charismatic leader comes along with a story that invites us in.
Yeah. That's great. So David Kreger writes, Dr. Stephen Covey wrote on the shifting of American culture from a character quality focus to one based on charisma and personality. How do you see the shift being reversed or revealed in our culture today?
I do think that shift that he described is a kind of a different and very useful set of terms for much of what I've been describing, and this sense that if we talk about ourselves as having a personality that needs simply encouragement and freedom from any possible fetter or duty, to become the most authentic expression of what it's meant to be, right? That key word in our culture, authenticity. It's a way of talking about human flourishing that diminishes our relationship to institutions, and gives us this false picture of ourselves as totally atomized, beings who can just sit contentedly on our couches, scrolling our glowing rectangles, catering to our personality, right? Because that's what the algorithms do, and it's combined in this especially poisonous sense with the illusion that we can learn whatever we want to about whatever topic we want to do our own research about, because the internet is at our fingertips. When of course there are major blinkers imposed on whatever information we're gathering about the world, through the kind of selection process that happens via algorithms. I think, if the question is, are we at a sort of turning point? And I mean, I detected in your conversation a couple of weeks ago with Will Inboden, this came up, and I'm seeing some of the same things that he is seeing. I'm seeing among younger people, my own students. And this is only anecdotal, but it's meaningful. A kind of exhaustion and a
Mhm.
sense that this story that they've grown up with, that all of these digital tools and the total breakdown of all confinements on who they are free to define themselves as, that this will bring freedom and happiness. They're beginning to suspect it's a lie. And I mean, I'm a bit pessimistic, so I shrink back from confidence that we're seeing some radical turn. But certainly, I mean, I interpret the modest but meaningful uptick in religious involvement among younger people, especially young men, as a sign of a desire for a new source of identity and structure, that is maybe a bit of a course correction against what we've seen play out over the past couple of generations, and a
Mhm.
desire to move from following a YouTube guru to having the structure of a tradition.
Yeah. We're going to try to squeeze in one more question. So Benson Hines says, in an organization with a charismatic leader, are there systems or practices that can keep the potential problems of charisma and or the leader's own weaknesses in check for the good of both the organization and the leader? So I'll pose Benson's questions, but I'll also kind of invite you to kind of like dilate much more broadly about just what all this research has kind of led you to do, just in terms of your own habits or practices of attention, of prayer, of discernment, in terms of just better discerning um, uh, the movement of the spirit, from a charisma which can distort and deform.
I think, one of the great geniuses of American evangelicalism is the way as a culture it has nurtured spiritual entrepreneurship and in general the kind of weak ecclesiology, the relatively weakness of church institutions that I think is a fair generalization, although still a generalization of American evangelicalism. I mean, it has nurtured this incredibly fractious and energetic culture in which it's very easy to hang up your own shingle and start your own church and become a mega church warlord or have a media ministry of global scale. And that's part of what has really contributed to the flourishing of American Christianity and the way in which the United States has maintained a level of vibrant religiosity compared to its Western counterpart countries. At the same time, that has contributed to a weakness in the kinds of checks and balances and guardrails that I think more hierarchical churches have on the what happens when you have kind of human depravity combined with power. This is not to say that more hierarchical churches don't have their own problems.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
absolutely do,
We know
right?
they do. Yes.
But I think there's a particular type of
Mhm.
there are a set of temptations that come with evangelical culture. So I think it's important to do, a clear-eyed assessment of the structure in which a leader is operating, and that assessment has to focus on the accountability structures. Is in a church setting, is the pastor does he have a kind of veto power, or is he on par with and under the discipline of his board of elders? Is there some other set of bodies, whether denominational or otherwise, that are kind of keeping an eye on things? And I think this is connected to the practices that are demanded of us as individuals. In prior eras of American history, I think in many ways it was easier for individuals to evaluate, make sense of the story presented to them by a charismatic leader, because most of us were embedded in institutions and traditions, communities that probably weren't premised on a systematic scientific evaluation of sociological facts, but still
Mhm.
offered counter narratives, offered other stories, about how the world works, that you had to kind of put the charismatic leader's story alongside and say, okay, does this make sense? I'm hearing these other things. I have these other authorities in mind. And that ecosystem has gotten out of whack, in our current moment, as we've seen Americans' trust in institutions erode to really a nadir. I think there are fewer counterweights, and so now I think the onus is on us as kind of ordinary people to be mindful of this dynamic and to say, okay, as I'm beginning to find myself compelled by this leader, let me ask myself, what is the story he or she is inviting me into? And how might I begin to evaluate whether that story is premised on facts, or if I'm seeing, other people in my life begin to fall under the influence of a leader, and I have a lot of questions, and I'm really concerned. Let me ask, am I revolted by this dynamic because I am being written out of this story? And what do I make of that? Is that legitimate, or is it premised on a false set of claims? So it's a constant, habit of self-interrogation that I think we're called to.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, Molly, thank you. This has been fascinating. And in just a moment, I'm going to give you the last word. But before that, a few things just to share with all of you joining us. First, immediately after we conclude, we will be sending out an online feedback form. We would love to get your feedback. We read each and every one of these. It really does help us in terms of trying to make this program ever more valuable. And as a small token of our appreciation, if you fill out that feedback form, we will send you a coupon code for a free Trinity Forum reading download of your choice. There are several that we would recommend that are germane to some of the ideas that we've discussed today, including William Wilberforce, A Man Who Changed His Times, This Child Will Be Great, the story of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, Who Stands Fast by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Politics, Morality, and Civility by Václav Havel. In addition, we will be sending around an email tomorrow, probably right around noon or so, with a lightly edited link to today's online conversation, as well as a list of other readings and resources if you want to go more deeper into exploring some of the questions that we've discussed today. In addition, I want to invite all of you joining us to join the Trinity Forum Society, which is the community of people who help advance the Trinity Forum mission of cultivating, curating, and disseminating the best of Christian thought for the common good. In addition to being part of this community and advancing this mission, there's a number of benefits, including a subscription to our quarterly readings, a subscription to our daily What We're Reading list of curated reading recommendations, and as a special incentive for anyone joining or with your contribution of $150 or more, we will send you a signed copy of Molly Worthen's fascinating and really provocative book, Spellbound. So we hope that you will avail yourself of that opportunity, and we would love to welcome you into the Trinity Forum Society. A few events to share coming up. For those of you who are in or near Nashville, on Monday, we will be there live and in person and hosting poet and senior fellow Malcolm Guite to discuss his new Arthurian epic and the role of Arthur and poetry. It'll be a lovely evening. We really hope that you can join us if you're anywhere near the area. And then next month, for those of you who are in or near DC on November 19th, we will be having the inaugural event of the Michael Gerson Memorial Prize, and awarding that at a conversation around the moral duty of the writer in an age of confusion. It will be held at the National Cathedral, and would love to see you there as well. We'll also be posting new online conversations coming soon, so stay tuned on our website and be on the lookout for that. As we wrap up, I want to thank my incredible colleagues at the Trinity Forum, my teammates Tom Walsh, Campbell Vogel, Marianne Morris, McCrae Henke, and Francis Owen, who put the mission of the Trinity Forum into action. And again, special thanks to you, Molly. It's been great to talk with you, and the last word is yours.
My bottom line, I guess, is that the 21st century is radically new in some ways, but fundamentally, we are not that different from humans 4 centuries ago. The advance of democracy, the rise of the internet, scientific literacy, all of this has not really severed us from the deep past and from this fundamental desire to connect with a transcendent story about the universe.
Molly, thanks so much. And thank you to all of you for joining us. Have a great weekend.